threshold.
Just under the threshold, absolutely. And Lopez de Prado published a neat paper on this as well. Now he sort of framed it as a type 1 versus type 2 error, and everyone focused on type 1, and we should all be focused on type 2. So instead of using a 5% cut threshold, you should use a 15% cut threshold to identify or accept that something is worth trading. But part of that is that you're also then going to get strategies that are below the typical threshold, that haven't caught the attention of the big academics, that haven't been published in the major journals, and therefore are unlikely to have a tidal wave of arbitrage capital flowing towards it. And so you're minimizing the chance of inversion, right? So how do you find anomalies that are not quite statistically significant? They're not published in the journals. Like, the fact is, you kind of got to do your own work. And then, of course, you get into, there's all sorts of problems in p-hacking and how you frame the experimental design and stuff that I'm sure we'll touch on another time.
Well, no, I mean, we don't. Can we touch upon it briefly? I think one of the key things that gives a sense of comfort in the original Palma French work is that there weren't a lot of people doing that stuff back then, because access to that data set was really tough to get. There weren't a lot of people looking at it from that perspective. They were really breaking some barriers there. And they did come at it from an honest economic theory perspective, that then they used this data to try and validate it. And when they use the data, more than today, right? Like, I mean, that.
Sure. Let's assume what you're. I'm not going to argue.
Just by pure computational power, the ability to have as many backtests as you can do, the type of data set that you had, and the fact that they were academics and trying to get some sort of credibility, rather than use that in order to make themselves rich necessarily, you would have more credence to the economic phenomenon, and that they use this process, this scientific method, purely to say, hey, is my theory valid? Let me use this data and test it once and see, oh yeah, look at that. That's a high p-value. This is, my thesis has been validated by the data, right? Whereas I'm not sure practitioners today, with the amount of access that we have, the ability to use as many backtesting processes as we do, and everybody or a large portion of the population wanted to get published by having that high t-stat, high p-value. Whether that today, when somebody comes up with an economic theory of what their backtest showed, which one came first? Or if they did come at it from an honest perspective, how many people like him were?
It's just very challenging. I mean, even if we assume a very high level of intellectual honesty among academics and practitioners who are publishing research, it's still very hard to disentangle the independent thinking from what came before. I mean, the whole nature of science is that there's a canon. There's a canon of research, of publications, and a paradigm that you're supposedly sort of building on, right? So if you're publishing research, typically you're already reading a lot of the papers, the seminal papers, the follow-on papers. Oftentimes a lot of the academics have already been playing with the data but like using the data for analysis for a large number of years. Yeah, they've been exposed to the data exactly for many years. And so you build an intuition there that's very hard to be independent of that intuition when you're forming hypotheses. Like, you may do your best as an academic or a practitioner to try to form a genuine economic hypothesis that's not informed by any sort of backtesting or any sort of data that you've seen before. But if you've already been exposed to the data for a long time, it's just really hard to separate yourself from your experience and generate a genuinely independent hypothesis to test. Would you agree?
Yeah. I think you become, it's all human nature as well, right? It's tough to be the lone wolf that comes up with a theory that nobody's ever talked about and you don't have, when you expound on it, nobody's like nodding and saying, yeah, I totally agree. In fact, I also think this way, and here's as many white papers as to why. It's a lot easier to be slightly influenced to the point where you come to a conclusion, then you do your back. I'm like, look what I have here. Isn't it amazing? And there's thousands of academics and practitioners saying, yeah, I'm also there with you. Everybody else is crazy. This is the way to go. Right.
It's
So
a really,
it
really
is
good
just
point, Rodrigo,
it's a tough
because I think
behavioral.
totally, and we've experienced this firsthand, and we obviously are friends with many other investors who are who have a lot of faith in their own take or approach on investing. And I think everybody tries to be intellectually honest, or the people that we know, most of them are try to be intellectually honest. But the reality is, if you're not sufficiently close to the Overton window, and so you don't have enough sort of other people that you respect also embracing that way of thinking, then it's almost impossible to raise.
Compromises your credibility.
It does, but it also just like people don't like to be lone wolves. So it's this weird. Yeah. The asset management business is this weird animal. Some people do, but it's this weird animal where if you're comfortable investing in it because the other people that you respect are also comfortable investing in it, and you've got access at a reasonable price and it's been made available to you, you probably don't want to own it. You know, if it's something that by virtue of being new and different and not having other people adopt it is not sufficient to say you should own it, right?
Yeah.
But it is, I think, ironically, a factor to consider, right? If it's something that you strongly believe in, you've gone down a rabbit hole, you've got good research and good backing, you've got strong intuition on it, and you're not seeing it anywhere else, that's probably a really good place to look. And I'll give you anecdote, you know, the plural of anecdote is not data, and I hesitate to even talk about this, but as an example, our funds historically have taken advantage of and still do make use of the features of skewness and seasonality, right? Now, skewness and seasonality, there's a couple of papers on skewness in academia, but you never see skewness talked about in any sort of all premium strategies or CTA strategies. No one ever talks about it. It's very under the radar. Seasonality is almost like voodoo. It's like what? Like astrology, or, you know, what are you doing? What are you talking about? Right? But it's phases of the moon or some nonsense. But the reality is that seasonality and skewness have the same economic and statistical premia as the much more broadly known trend and carry strategies, and or at least historically. But over the last 3 to 5 years, skewness and seasonality have been terrific performers, and trend and carry have been dogs. So, you know, again, just anecdotes, but there's lots of money flown into trend strategies for crisis alpha or this or that, and trend has been, you know, in the dog.
Why are you telling everybody that?
Please can we edit that out live?
From the record? Edit that out.
Well,
I think Buck is raising another point too.
Mike, now you just made it real for people. God,
that's right. We got to talk about your analysis now. So
no, that's not the question. But it is one of thinking of this from the standpoint of, okay, so something goes through the process of publication, or this is what I'm going to interpret his question to be selfishly, for whatever reason. I don't care why. So if we think about the list the premium we might be able to harvest, right? And who's paying and what the size of that is and what the barriers to arbitraging that might be. So I know when we started very early, we trade lots of, 80 markets and lots of currencies and whatnot. But when you think about the barriers to arbitrage, what are the barriers for other participants to come in and share that lunch, that free lunch for you? So the rebalancing premium, I think, is what Buck is referring to, is when you publish your paper, eventually when you publish it, if ever, because it'll eviscerate any premia that would be there from the rebalancing.
That's it, exactly. I'm holding it back now. There's no way I'm holding it.
Because we're just not going to publish it. It's out there. It works. You'll just have to take our word for it.
Exactly.
But again, this kind of comes back to Corey's question too long ago, like who pays for that? So what's the barrier? And if we think about all these things, well, how easy is this thing that you're going to deploy? How easy is it for it to be replicated? And then for subsequent assets to flow to it in order to take that free lunch and split it amongst the commons, if you will, right? And take it away from you. So if we think about that, what would they be? I mean, obviously in any kind of single stock type thing, you've got ETFs, the proliferation of ETFs and easy rules. And So tons of capital can flow to that area. I think rebalancing is harder. I mean, large pools of assets are not particularly well equipped to transport the liquidity they might have in their portfolio across asset classes in order to arb that lack of liquidity.
Active risk constraints and board constraints and actuarial constraints and all kinds of constraints that.
So that helps. But are there any other ideas about that? Anything else trigger in your minds? I'm just kind of thinking this.
Well, I mean, what's triggering for me is I'd be a lot more worried about somebody arbitraging the rebalancing premium and risk parity if we could get anybody to write a goddamn ticket for risk parity. Like, I don't actually think. I don't have any concern about the opportunity in global risk parity across 65 or 80 futures markets going away anytime soon.
Agreed. Not popular, received with vitriol at every corner.
But this is an example of where this is why you want to cover the whole term structure thing, right? Let's say you do a risk parity strategy, you publish it, and you publish that you're going to be rebalancing on the last business day of every month, right? You're telling me that somebody's not going to arb that out. If everybody gets on that side, that premium is going to kind of go away, and then it's going to get so bad that there's going to be other people trying to eat their lunch in reverse. Right? There's flows going in. You know that it's happening, and you're going to take advantage of that.
F squared.
So how do you?
I thought everybody had just embraced Corey's tranching concept. Am I wrong about that? I thought that was widely adopted.
He's still banging his head against the wall on that. There's only like 5 of us that actually believe in that
if
stuff.
Someone knows, he knows.
But the point is, right?
There's a guy who knows. That guy knows.
If you're going to be rebalancing, right? If there is a rebalancing premium, I mean, you don't want to necessarily publish your schedule. You don't want to do it on a consistent basis. You might want to randomize it. You might want to caterpillar it so your flow isn't that strong. Like there's a wide variety of reasons why you want to be obscure, even about the rebalancing approach. Because if you do make it popular and you do show a backtest that rebalancing on the 27th of every month is the time to do it, it will go away, right? It will go away.
But I think that the rebalancing side of it is well outside of what we might call the ivory tower bias, right? This idea that it's so well established that everybody's gonna. But what is one to do then, Adam, to shy away from this ivory tower bias, this idea that people are just going to stay within the middle of the herd?